Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the ICG's Digital Academy webinar series. I'm Sally Alsop, the committee member responsible for our webinar programme. Oops, went too quickly. So today's webinar is about the applications of behavioural science to quantitative research. And for this, we're delighted to welcome back ICG member Chris Harvey. Chris is the founder of Activate Research, which inspires change and drives growth through enabling a deeper understanding of how people think and why they behave as they do. Drawing on an MSc in behavioural science and 15 years research industry experience, Activate Research adds complementary insights and approaches from behavioural science and psychology more broadly to agencies' research offer. This webinar follows on from a similar session that Chris ran for us in early 2022, giving us an overview of how the behavioural science landscape has changed over this time. Chris says he's happy to take questions at the end, so please type your questions into the chat box as we go along, or simply turn on your webcam and raise your hand to ask your question yourself. So this webinar is generously sponsored by Choice Insight from Dobney.com. We think that Saul Dobney, who's an ICG member, might be on this call, so welcome, Saul, if you are. Choice provides a toolkit of better ways of doing surveys and better ways of asking questions. Developed over more than 20 years, Choice is an end-to-end platform that reimagines what research can be. Before we begin, here are some more events that we've got planned for you over the coming weeks. Don't forget that we're able to offer great value sponsorship opportunities with each of our webinars and online events. Just contact Lucy if you have any questions, would like to know more. Okay, so now I'm going to hand over to our speaker, Chris Harvey. Welcome, Chris. I'll stop sharing.
Great, so thanks so much, Sally. Morning, everyone. Just let me try and share my screen.
That's looking good. We can see it if you just put it on full screen mode.
Great stuff. Thanks,
Fantastic.
Sally. Okay, so morning, everyone, and welcome to today's session. Thanks very much for taking the time to join. So, as Sally mentioned, today's session is all about applications of behavioural science to market research, and in particular to quantitative market research. And I guess the general sort of backdrop to that, if you like, is that quite a lot has been done over the last decade or perhaps more, sort of fusing qualitative research with behavioural science. But not so much has been done in the quant space, and this is where I believe there's a huge opportunity to do much more. So over the next probably 45 minutes or so, I'm going to take you through three specific applications within behavioural science that are particularly well suited to quantitative research, although at the same time are also relevant, very relevant to the qual space. And my sort of basic goal, if you like, is that everyone should go away from this session in a much better position to both understand, predict and influence behaviour using nothing more than good old-fashioned quantitative surveys. So a very brief summary of me and my company, Activate Research, before I start. So as Sally mentioned, we're all about inspiring change and driving growth through enabling a deeper understanding of how people think and why they behave as they do. This is all done through insights and approaches from behavioural science, which, as I say, is all about helping. The ultimate end goal is that the end client is better able to understand, predict and influence target audience behaviour. Very briefly, I tend to work mostly with agencies. And I have sort of, I guess, three core offers. So I have one called Equip, which is about training. I have a consulting offer called Embed, and then I have a project-based offer where I work with agencies, typically on a project-by-project basis, on both qual and quant projects, bringing behavioural science into the project. So before I give a sort of overview of what the day is going to cover and get started, I thought it'd be very useful to get in place a nice, simple working definition of what behavioural science actually is. And then I guess in what seems like days of ever decreasing trust in political leadership, I'm going back 9 years to 2015, and President Obama, who at the time said, a growing body of evidence demonstrates that behavioural science insights, research findings from fields such as behavioural economics and psychology about how people make decisions and act on them, can be used to design government policies to better serve the American people. And my sort of ambition for today's session is not quite as grand as designing government policies to serve 300-something million people. But the reason I put this slide up was that I really like this nice, simple definition that Obama provides of behavioural science as being about how people make decisions and act on them. So that's the simple definition that I'd like us to keep in mind for the rest of this session. What we're going to cover today, there's 5 key sections, of which, as I say, there are 3 key, what I call application areas within behavioural science we're going to cover. The first of these is behaviour change models. And behaviour change models effectively are great at providing a structure to help us to both understand what's going on currently in a particular situation from a behavioural perspective, but also to think about barriers to future change in behaviours. So that's the first section. The second key application area is going to be on behavioural economics, which I'm guessing is probably the area most people on the call have probably heard the most about within the behavioural science space. But I'm guessing perhaps more so in the qualitative rather than quantitative space. And then the last of the 3 application areas I'm going to cover really quite quickly is personality psychology. And this is all about how, if we can get a deeper understanding of how people are in general, how they behave across many different situations, that can help us if we're trying to unpick what's driving behaviour in one particular situation. And then lastly, before we have time for Q&A at the end, I'm going to provide sort of 3 quick tips on putting all this stuff into action, because I guess in my experience, and I'm sure in many of your experiences as well, telling people about a bunch of things is no guarantee that they're going to be able to go and translate that immediately into their everyday work. So 3 quick tips on the end from a behavioural science perspective, again, in putting those 3 key application areas into action. So hopefully everybody is in the right place and is still keen to carry on. So let's start with behaviour change models. So the first question I guess to ask, what are behaviour change models and why should we be interested in them? So the kind of probably quite technical, dry definition, if you like, of a model is a model describes the operation or mechanism of something. It describes how something works. The definition I prefer to use is a model provides a structure, as I said in the introduction, to help us to better understand and investigate what's going on in a particular situation, and indeed make changes, drive changes if that's something we want to do. And I guess there are 3 key benefits that I'll try and demonstrate to you over the next few slides of why we should be interested in behaviour change models, as I say, in the qual space, but particularly even more so in the quant space. So the first key benefit of behaviour change models is that they are great at providing us or helping us to develop a set of hypotheses which we can then go and test about what may or may not be driving or inhibiting the particular behaviour we want to see. That's the kind of the key benefit, helping us to develop and test hypotheses. Models are also really good though at helping us to structure our findings. So if we present findings back to clients within the context of a recognised behaviour change model, that can be very valuable in helping clients to better understand and even interrogate the findings that we're presenting. And lastly, if behaviour change is one of our objectives, then designing research within the context of a behaviour change model can be very valuable at helping us to recommend, generate and test what we call behaviour change interventions. So to try and sort of bring this to life a bit more, I'm going to introduce you to a model which 1 or 2 of you may have heard of, which I use quite a lot and which will kind of form the basis of the next kind of 10 minutes or so in this particular session. So the COMB model was developed out of University College London by synthesising findings from 19 different behaviour change frameworks. So from a kind of academic rigour perspective, it's got great academic rigour, but at the same time, it's pretty intuitive and it's pretty applicable across a wide range of situations. And in a nutshell, the COM-B model basically says that in order to do a particular behaviour, we need to have each of three things. We need to have the capability, we need to have the opportunity, and we also need to have the motivation. And if all three of those things are not there, then the behaviour won't occur. What do I mean by capability, opportunity, and motivation? So first of all, let's look at capability. So capability, it depends on the behaviour we're talking about. If we're talking about a physical behaviour, capability is typically talking about things like people having the requisite skills or stamina or strength to do a physical behaviour. More often than not, though, in the market research world, we're talking about what they call psychological capability, which is around people's necessary knowledge and skills to do a behaviour. So that's the first thing. People need to have the knowledge and skills, and that comes under the banner of capability. However, if we want a behaviour to happen, people need also to have the requisite opportunity. This is most typically around having a conducive physical environment. So this is around things like whether people have the necessary time, for example, to do a behaviour, whether they have the necessary access to a behaviour, sometimes whether they have the necessary money to do a behaviour. So opportunity is mostly around physical, although it can sometimes be around social environment. So whether they have a socially conducive environment, so whether the behaviour there we want them to do is the sort of thing that other people see as acceptable. And last but not least, people also need to have sufficiently strong motivation. It's all very well having the knowledge and having the time and the access and so on. But if they don't believe that behaviour is something that is worthwhile, then they're not going to do it. So motivation is most typically around perceptions of the behaviour and beliefs around whether they believe they're able to do that behaviour and that behaviour is something that is worthwhile to them to do. So I mentioned a couple of slides ago about using models to help us develop hypotheses. So I'm going to give you a very quick example here to start with of how we might use this model to develop hypotheses about why a behaviour may or may not be occurring. So a large amount of the work I do is in the health and pharma space, so a lot of work with patients and physicians and so on. And one nice kind of hopefully simple illustration comes from, imagine if we wanted to understand smoking cessation advice provided by GPs by GPs to patients, and we wanted to speculate and develop hypotheses about what may be inhibiting that particular behaviour. So remember a slide or two back, I talked about capability. One of the key facets of capability being about knowledge. So one particular hypothesis we might want to develop in this scenario, amongst many potentially, is have GPs got sufficient knowledge about these smoking cessation approaches? It sounds obvious, but if we want them to do this behaviour and provide this advice, they need to have sufficient knowledge. However, as I mentioned, they also need to have opportunity. So, for example, one particular hypothesis we might want to investigate here is the extent to which these GPs have actually got the time, the opportunity to fit this type of advice into what's typically a very narrow sort of 10-minute window with patients. And lastly, again, another brief example of motivation might be to test the hypothesis. Do we believe that physicians believe that these types of approaches are worthwhile? So again, they may have the knowledge, but if they haven't got the opportunity and the motivation, they are not going to do this behaviour. So that's an example of developing hypotheses. How about testing these hypotheses quantitatively? So again, this is another sort of pharma example, recent study where the end client wanted to understand effectively what were the drivers and barriers to physicians prescribing their particular treatment. Physicians weren't prescribing as much as they'd like them to do, so they wanted to understand a bit more about why that might be occurring. And effectively what we did is again, another sort of simple example, is we used the COM-B model to develop and to structure a set of hypotheses around these three key pillars of capability, opportunity, and motivation. So in this particular scenario, the client had a bunch of existing research we were able to interrogate, and we came up with 6 simple statements on a 7-point agreement scale, intended to measure people's readiness, if you like, to prescribe this particular treatment. So, for example, under capability, the two red bars, we can see we asked about people's knowledge about the efficacy of this particular treatment or the effectiveness of this particular drug. Under capability, we also asked about knowledge about safety aspects. In green, we can see under opportunity, we asked about ease of prescribing from both an access and a reimbursement perspective. And under motivation, the two key performance indicators were relaxation in prescribing and confidence that they could achieve enhanced patient outcomes with this particular treatment. So essentially what this enables us to do really is to produce some really nice, simple kind of top line KPIs and to, as I say, report back how people are doing or their readiness to prescribe on each of these three areas. So we can see that under capability, this particular drug is performing pretty moderately, really. So 46 and 41% say they're knowledgeable about the efficacy and safety. It's scoring really quite poorly on opportunity, so ease of prescribing. Only about a third of people on both of those metrics are saying they're able to do that from a physical opportunity perspective. And we've got a bit of a mixed bag on motivation, really. We've got 75% of the sample saying they're confident in achieving enhanced outcomes, but at the same time, only 37% saying they feel relaxed about prescribing it. So hopefully that makes sense, and it's all sort of pretty simple so far. However, what quantitative research enables us to do over qualitative research is to go a little bit deeper into the findings. So I mentioned a few slides back that the model was all about capability, opportunity, and motivation needing to be present. One thing I didn't mention a couple of slides ago, which is very useful to us, as I say, particularly in quant research, is what I tend to sometimes call these interconnecting influences, which is that the model also predicts that capability is a driver of motivation, and opportunity is also a driver of motivation. So to kind of try and explain that a bit more clearly, so the model predicts that the more capable you are, the better you get at something, the more motivated you will be to do that behavior, and vice versa. The less capable you are, the less motivated you'll be. And by the same token, under opportunity, it says the greater the opportunity you have to do behavior, the more motivated you will be to do it. And again, vice versa. And the reason this is so valuable to us, as I say, particularly in quant research, is it enables us to go a little bit deeper into these key performance indicators and the relationships between them. If I return to the example from a couple of slides ago, where we were talking about why weren't physicians prescribing this particular product to their patient, and we looked at 6 key performance indicators. What we then went on to do in that project was to look at the relationships between some of these different key pillars of the model. So first of all, we looked at the relationship between capability key performance indicators and the motivation key performance indicators to see whether this prediction of the model held true, that the more capable you are to do something, the more motivated you are. So if you remember a couple of slides back, we had, I think it was 37% said they were relaxed about prescribing this particular treatment. What we were able to do through very simple crosstabs was to break this down a little bit further and to understand why is this 37% so low? What's driving that low motivation or that low relaxation to prescribe? And what we found is that one particular thing which was really important is one of the capability performance indicators, knowledge about safety aspects, was, as predicted by the model, shown to be a very significant driver of relaxation in prescribing. So to explain this little chart here in more detail, what we found is that 37% broke out into 2 different groups when we looked at those knowledgeable about safety aspects versus those not knowledgeable. And what we found is that those knowledgeable were significantly more likely to feel relaxed about prescribing the treatment as predicted by the model than those not knowledgeable, and a difference of 41 percentage points there. So what does that tell us? Well, a couple of key things. First of all, it tells us that knowledge about safety is an important key performance indicator. It is strongly linked to relaxation in prescribing, the motivation metrics, so it's something we should care about trying to improve if we want to increase behaviour towards this product. And the second thing it tells us is that if we do want to increase prescribing this product, which the client did, a very good way to improve this relaxation metric is through safety knowledge. So again, this chart is basically telling us that the greater the safety knowledge, the more likely people are to be relaxed about prescribing it. So we want to increase relaxation and behaviour towards the product. Increasing people's knowledge of safety aspects would be a very good way to go. Very quickly, a similar type of thing, looking at some of the opportunity KPIs and how they related to the motivation KPIs. Again, we have this 37% relaxation prescribing overall figure, and we found that those who found this particular product easier to access were much more relaxed about prescribing it, significantly more so than those who didn't find it easy to access. So in terms of the sort of takeaways, again, we had validation that ease of access is an important key performance indicator. In this, it's a key driver of relaxation in prescribing. And then again, we were able to say to the client, if you want to improve relaxation in prescribing and hence prescribing of this particular treatment, a great way to do that would be also through improving access. So just to finish up this first section, hopefully that all makes sense so far. A couple of key benefits, if you like, really. The first key benefit is that this type of analysis can really help clients to improve their investment decision making. So as I say, if we think back, we had 37% of our total sample saying they were relaxed about prescribing. But if we looked at those who had good safety knowledge, that figure of relaxation went up to 61%. So again, if we're able to boost safety knowledge, we can potentially take that level of relaxation in prescribing up to 61% overall. Similarly, under improving access, this 37% could be increased to 58%. So if we're thinking about how much investment we want to make, we might be comparing investment in terms of improving access versus improving safety knowledge. This can give us a good steer in terms of the types of uplifts we can expect to see as a result of that investment. And I haven't done it here, but another thing we can do is we can convert, if we like, if we're particularly working in a consumer space or something where sample sizes are a lot bigger. If we want to, we can convert these uplift percentages into total figures. So again, we're able to say for X amount of spend, we believe we might be able to get X more people, whatever the metric is, towards our product. And the last, or another key benefit I want to finish off with when it comes to models, particularly in the quant space, is that using models can help us to both save time and also money. And the reason I say this is that effectively, if we go into a particular scenario with a particular model, or perhaps one or two models in mind, and we go in with a clear idea of the types of analysis we want to do, such as, for example, as I showed, looking at the relationships between capability and motivation performance indicators, that can, depending on the situation, that can hugely cut down the analysis time. So rather than kind of scrabbling around, looking for a series of potential correlations between different data points, going in with a clear model can really help us to hugely cut down analysis time. Which, again, if we save time, we're potentially able to do more revenue generating activities, for example, that in the long run can also save us money. So that's the first of the three key application areas. I guess two sort of key points to finish up with. The first is that whilst COMBI is a very effective model, there are many different models and theories out there. If anybody wants to go away and read this book, this has got 83 different behaviour change theories in there, some of which are more useful than others, but some of which I also use on a regular basis. And I guess the last point on this section is to say that, I sort of focused a bit on this kind of typical kind of drivers and barriers type of study here. But the COMBI model and others can also be used in various other situations, such as, for example, brand tracking, segmentations, and so on. There are a lot of different applications of models within the quant space. So, moving on to section 2, I've talked quite a bit so far. So at this particular, probably halfway point, I'd like us to do 3 very quick polls in order to introduce or help introduce the second section on behavioural economics. So Sally, I don't know whether I need to stop sharing for you to run these, or whether you can just jump in and run these polls.
I think I can just launch the first poll, so let me know if it comes through okay.
Yeah.
Can you see it?
That's come through to me. Hopefully everybody else can see that. So these are 3 quick, simple yes or no answers. The first question is, have you ever spent some or all of an unexpected monetary gift or bonus on a treat for now, rather than saving it for the future? Hopefully everybody can see that and they can all respond yes or no, please.
We've got 13 responses. Should we end the poll? 14? Is that everyone?
Great stuff.
Okay.
Have we got excellent? Oh wow, okay, that's a pretty resounding 100% are saying they've done that. Great stuff.
Okay.
If you do the second one, please.
Yep.
Thanks, Sally. The second question, if everybody could do a quick yes or no. Have you ever ordered a main course you previously ordered while eating out at your favourite restaurant?
Okay, 14 responses there. Shall I end the poll?
Yes, please.
Okay. Check the results.
Right, very conclusive again. 100% of you said you've done that. And finally, we've got one more, please.
Can you see that one?
I can't see it at the moment.
Oh, well, people are responding, so that's...
Oh, okay. All right. Well, that's not... that's fine. Oh, great. That's come up on my screen.
Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you.
There we go. I think we've got everyone now. Can you see the results?
Yes, thanks, Sally. Slight deviation, 93%. Excellent. Right, thanks very much, Sally, for that. Okay. Right, thank everybody for doing those. The logic behind that will become clear in a slide or two. So moving on to the second of the 3 key application areas, behavioural economics. So again, let's start off with the definition. Very similarly to the definition I presented earlier from Barack Obama about behavioural science being about how people make decisions and act on them, I tend to use basically the same definition for behavioural economics. But behavioural economics, the sphere or the breadth of decision making is much more narrow. Behavioural economics is much more about economic factors. Behavioural science is much more broad. So what is behavioural science? Well, what is behavioural economics? Behavioural economics is most typically about trying to help us to understand and explain behaviour through 2 key terms, which are heuristics and biases. So first of all, a heuristic is essentially a shortcut rule of thumb that we use in often complex situations to try and minimise that complexity. And heuristics we've developed over time have generally been pretty good and served us as human beings quite well. Unfortunately, the second key area is which we also use to help explain behaviour is this notion of cognitive biases. And cognitive biases have a bit more of a negative connotation. So cognitive biases are effectively systematic errors in decision making that humans make. and I'll illustrate that shortly. And cognitive biases are really sort of what are responsible for what people sometimes call seemingly irrational or seemingly illogical behaviours. And as this book says, far from Homo economicus, we often seem closer to Homo simpson economicus in our decision making. And it's really the area of biases, I guess, that provides us with the most scope, if you like, for getting deeper under the skin of what's driving consumer behaviour. Because believe it or not, there are over 200 of these cognitive biases that have been developed, that have been identified and documented by behavioural economists. Okay, so why did I ask those seemingly random questions a couple of minutes ago? Well, the idea of those questions was to illustrate to you some key cognitive biases in action. So the first question we looked at was, have you ever, I'm not sure these came up in exact order, one of the key questions, have you ever sat through to the end of a movie at the cinema that you didn't like? I think 93%, so almost all of us said that was something we'd done. And if we think from a behavioural economics standpoint, the behavioural economics explanation of why we've done this particular behaviour would be something called sunk cost bias. And sunk cost bias effectively describes how the more we invest in something, the harder we find it to abandon. So that would be the kind of behavioural or the key behavioural bias that was driving that decision that many of us had to sit through to the end of the movie at the cinema, even though we didn't like it. Another question we asked, have you ever ordered a main course you previously ordered while eating out at your favourite restaurant? And all of us have done that, so 100% of us were influenced by something called the familiarity heuristic, which is a preference of things we already know over things that are unfamiliar to us. And the final question, which again all of us owned up to, was that 100% of us had spent some or all of an unexpected monetary gift or bonus on a treat for now, rather than saving it for the future. And again, the behavioural economics explanation behind this would be that we've been influenced by something called present bias, which is effectively where we give more weight to the present than to the future. So hopefully you can kind of see that most of us, in fact almost all of us, were subject or influenced by one or more of these particular heuristics and biases. And so I guess the kind of corollary to that really is that if we're influenced by them, then perhaps so are our market research respondents. So as I say, there's over 200 of these cognitive biases, and hopefully we can see that none of us are immune to them. But 200 is a lot. Where do we start, and how can we actually start building some of this stuff into our design of our quantitative research projects? Quite a nice place to start really, or to turn to, is behavioural frameworks. So there are a few different frameworks that have been developed. And the idea of these frameworks is to capture some of the most common behavioural biases that have been identified. So this particular framework is called the Mindspace framework, and this documents 9 quite common, powerful behavioural biases that have been identified under this nice Mindspace mnemonic. So I won't go through all of these now, but for example, if we take the first of these, messenger, this talks about a large amount of research that's been done, which has found that as well as what people are, the information people are communicating to us, who it is that's communicating that information to us is very, very important and has a very strong effect on our subsequent behaviour. And there's a couple of links at the bottom if anybody wants to find the paper or a frameworks and models guide I've done, which kind of does a bit more detail on this and other frameworks. Then please go to my website. So as I say, how do we actually go about using one of these frameworks in practice in designing our research? Well, effectively, in this framework and other frameworks, these biases can be used as potential prompts or hypotheses that we might want to investigate. So, for example, imagine we were trying to get a deeper understanding of consumers renewing their car insurance and what's the decision-making process behind that. One particular hypothesis we might want to test as a result of knowledge of this Mindspace framework would be the impact of social norms. So, for example, there's quite obviously a lot of review or peer review websites that are out there now. So we might want to test, for example, to what extent are people influenced by online reviews / others when renewing their car insurance. That would be under the social norms hypothesis. Similarly, under D in Mindspace, D stands for defaults, and this is about how a lot of the time, particularly in these types of situations where we're doing a task like renewing car insurance that's not particularly interesting, we might want to, or we often go with the flow of preset options. So another question we might ask in a quantitative capacity here is, to what extent do you go with the flow of preset options when you're renewing your car insurance? So asking about this quantitatively can be very valuable. It can help us, for example, first of all, quantify and compare the size of these effects. So is social norms, for example, a bigger driver than defaults on people's behaviour in this particular situation? We can profile these types of things as well. So, for example, are males more prone to one of these particular biases? Are certain groups of customers more prone to one of these particular biases? And lastly, is the type of thing that can be quite useful sometimes in segmentations as well. So perhaps alongside other variables around attitudes and perceptions and so on. So hopefully that makes a quite nice direct way of asking about behavioural biases. There are a couple of caveats, however, although there are workarounds in a quantitative space when it comes to these biases. The first caveat is that while there are over 200 of these biases, not all of these biases are things that respondents are particularly aware of. And so asking a direct question about something may not always be most appropriate depending on the particular bias we're trying to investigate, and indeed the broader situation the research is taking place in. The second key caveat to be aware of is that respondents, depending on what the bias we're asking about, they're not always necessarily willing to answer honestly or to own up to being influenced by a particular bias. However, we do have a situation, or we do have a solution in quantitative research for getting around these particular caveats. And I'm going to finish this section with a quick demonstration of that. So one particular bias which people are not necessarily always very aware of is something called the framing bias. And the framing bias describes how the way information is presented to us can have a very significant impact on the way we make judgments and behave off the back of it. So I'm going to finish this section by demonstrating framing bias to you through a particular approach which draws on something called randomized controlled trials or split samples approach, which we're able to do quantitatively, as I say, in order to identify some of those biases that people are unaware of, or in some cases less keen to admit to. So this was a study from a few years ago by Prospector YouGov, and they first of all asked a sample of NatRep sample of 2,000 people. They said the BBC licence fee, the TV licence costs £145.50 a year. Is this good or bad value for money? And as we can see, 27% not very good, said it was good value for money, and exactly twice as many said it was bad value for money. However, in this study, to illustrate this thing called framing bias, the authors ran a second question on a different but also nationally representative sample of 2,000 people. This time they said the BBC licence fee costs £12.13 a month. Is this good or bad value for money? And I'm sure you've all spotted by now that £12.13 a month is exactly the same as £145.50 a year. So in theory, if this thing called framing bias didn't exist, we would expect the responses to be exactly the same, or indeed, or if not very, very similar. But what we see on the right-hand side is that this has changed the responses quite significantly. So where we had 27% saying it was good value at £145.50 a year, we've now got 37% saying it's good value when it's framed as £12.13 a month. And bizarrely, the neither and don't know figures are exactly the same, and that 10% swing, which is very highly statistically significant based on these sample sizes, that 10% has gone straight from the good value to the bad value. So hopefully that makes sense, and hopefully you can see how while there are lots of biases that we can ask about directly, there are a few that we can't ask about directly. But at least in quantitative research, if we have decent sample sizes, this type of approach can help us to identify these types of biases. And if anybody wants to learn more, this is a book I would strongly recommend, Behavioural Economics, the basics. So please go away and get that if you'd like to know more about behavioural economics. Okay, the last of the three application areas is personality psychology. So this is going to be a very whistle-stop tour. We're pretty short of time. And again, first of all, what is psychology, and why should we be potentially interested in it? Well, the definition of personality is that personality is basically the general tendency that we have to behave consistently across different situations. And there are four key properties of personality that make it something that we really should be interested if we're wanting to understand behaviour. The first key property of personalities is that personalities are distinct. So there's a whole bunch of ways in which everyone on this call is similar to each other, but there's also a whole bunch of ways in that we are different to each other, or distinct from each other. And these differences in personality have been shown to be responsible for really quite strong differences when it comes to actual behaviour. The second key thing about personalities are they can change in the very, very long term, but they're typically stable in the short and medium term. So if we collect information about personality, it's going to be valid for a pretty good length of time. The third key benefit is that people generally display pretty good self-knowledge. They are generally quite good at reporting or self-reporting in an accurate way when you ask them to describe their personality. And the last thing, which is by far the most important, is that there's lots of evidence out there that says that personalities or personality traits are very good at explaining and predicting behaviour. How would we go about collecting personality information? As you probably expect, in the academic community, there are lots of different ways to do it, and lots of different agreements and disagreements over things. But generally, the consensus is that a model called Ocean, or the Big Five framework, is the most robust way of collecting information about people's personalities. How does Ocean work? Well, effectively, it works on 5 different dimensions, and people effectively rate themselves on a spectrum of high to low in terms of where they sit on each of these 5. So, for example, we've got the O under Ocean stands for openness to experience. So here we're measuring the extent to which people are saying they are inventive or curious types versus the extent to which they are consistent or cautious. And again, there's a whole bunch of reasons why Ocean is the best approach, which I won't go into now. But one of the key things is this ability to have people somewhere on a spectrum, typically a 7-point or 10-point scale, which makes it different to some of the more simplistic personality tests, such as, for example, Myers-Briggs, where effectively you are forcing people to say whether they are extrovert or introvert. There's no, for example, there's no room for nuance or to be anywhere in the middle between extroversion and introversion. There are various recognised scales out there for collecting personality traits in this particular way. Some of them are a bit too lengthy. What I sometimes use is a cut down version, which authors, again, or academic authors have developed, which is not quite as accurate as asking people 120 questions about their personality, but asking them 10 questions gets you most of the way there. So this is a typical kind of way of asking people to rate themselves on an agreement or a 7-point agreement scale as to the extent they see themselves as each of these different things. So two of these statements are mapped to each of the 5 different dimensions of the model. Very quickly, what are the key applications? What can we do when we collect this type of information quantitatively? we can do some nice simple profiling. That's the first thing of all. So, for example, within our sample, we can profile the extent to which particular customer types or particular people in particular age groups or particular segments, they're under indexing or over indexing on each of these different traits. Again, segmentation is a pretty nice application of personality traits. So I mentioned before, personality traits are good at predicting behavior, but at the same time, they are also quite stable over time. So adding this type of information to a segmentation, again, perhaps alongside attitudes and other types of variables, can be quite nice. Can be quite a nice application. And lastly, the biggest area, really, getting into a bit more detail, is we can explore the impacts of personality traits on behaviour. Without going into too much detail, there is a hell of a lot of academic evidence in a number of different scenarios that describes the relationship between people's personality traits and their likelihood to do or not do a particular behaviour. And so if we have awareness of some of this literature, we're able to go into research projects with particular hypotheses to test about, for example, the extent to which performance on a particular personality trait drives behaviour, and to analyse whether that comes out in our research data set. So lastly, again, if anybody wants to know more, this is a book I'd recommend, Personality by Daniel Nettle. And very finally, that's the whistle-stop tour of the three key areas. How do we go about putting all this stuff into action? This is one of the nice things about behavioural science, is that it can help us to start to think about some of the behavioural challenges of, for example, doing more behavioural science-informed quantitative research. So one key question, if we want to start using behavioural science in general or behavioural science in quantitative research, is what are the types of situation where it would be most, or it could be most useful to think about using behavioural science? What are the types of scenarios where it can be useful? Another nice book is the Behavioural Informed Organisation, and this presents three hypotheses or three different scenarios which they say are useful, which I've kind of found generally tends to be true. Behavioural science can be useful, first of all, if we're trying to resolve a business critical or high risk issue, such as, for example, why consumers are not doing what the organisation wants them to do. That can be a good scenario to take a behavioural science informed approach. The book also talks, and I've had a lot of success in this, is using behavioural science either in situations where other solutions have stagnated or failed. So when other solutions have stagnated, a good example of that is I've used behavioural science quite a bit in quantitative trackers as a way to freshen them up and provide deeper insights. Also, particularly behavioural science I found is particularly valuable when people have got long-standing, quite challenging problems that they've tried lots of different solutions for, and all of those have failed. A behavioural science solution can be a good opportunity to start talking to clients about behavioural science then. And lastly, the other side of the coin, in simple small-scale projects, they can be a nice way to start using behavioural science to basically demonstrate value in a quick and simple way, and to generate momentum. Another key challenge, I guess, I found working with clients is how to convince either colleagues or, a lot of the time, clients about behavioural science. Three quick tips on that. The first is basically to try and keep it as simple as you possibly can. I think all of us, particularly as researchers, we're all quite curious people. We always want to learn more, but there are limits to the extent at which people can take in lots of new information. So thinking of people as Homer Simpson, keeping it simple, presenting simple information to people is generally the best way to go. Showing, not telling, I guess, again, it sounds pretty obvious, but something I've sort of learned, I guess, over the years, really. if we can, for example, do a little poll which helps people to recognise their own behavioural economics biases, that can often be a more effective way than simply telling people, you are influenced by these biases. So show not tell is a nice way of introducing behavioural science to people. And lastly, like anything really, it's quite hard to do this stuff on your own. So identifying allies, for example, within your client organisations that you work with, people that have got an interest in this area that can help you to sell the benefits of it within their organisation. So trying to kind of identify and meet up with those key allies on a semi-regular basis in order to help sort of spread the word about behavioural science. And the last thing I'd say is don't be afraid to use these models to help understand your own challenges, particularly, for example, when it comes to applying behavioural science in practice. So I talked earlier about, how can we use capability, opportunity, and motivation to understand why consumers or why physicians aren't doing particular behaviours. One of the great things about behavioural science is that we can use these models to develop hypotheses about why some of our own behaviours might not be occurring. So if we want to bring behavioural science back into organisations or to sell it to clients, have clients got the capability, the opportunity, and the motivation to do that? And if not, how can we help them to get those things? So that's the end of today's session. Thanks everybody for joining. If anybody wants to know more, there's sort of three different avenues, if you like. The first one is I've got an upcoming Market Research Society online workshop in May. So that's going to go into a lot more detail within the three key areas that I covered today, but a lot more detail, particularly in the model space, and a lot more exercises and so on for you to get to grips with that. So if you're interested in that, please go to the MRS website. If you can't spare a whole day, but you want to know a little bit more, please drop me an email or go to my website. There's a 30-page guide where I've written up the things I've covered today, but also quite a bit more. Applications of behavioural science to quant market research. Please go away and request that free publication if you'd like to. And lastly, if you haven't got a day or you haven't got time to read a 30-page report, I've got a nice succinct monthly email newsletter that goes out to people. So if you like to receive monthly short nuggets of behavioural science news and information and book reviews and event recommendations and so on, please just sign up to my monthly email newsletter. So thanks very much, everybody. Hopefully that made sense and wasn't too much information to take in. Thanks for joining, and please, if you've got any questions, do let me know now.
That was amazing. Thank you, Chris. Once again, really enlightening review of behavioural science and how we can use it in market research, particularly quant research. We've got about 7 minutes, I think. I've been told that we have to shut down at 12 o'clock exactly because Lucy needs the Zoom platform. So has anybody got any particular burning questions they'd like to ask Chris? Please put your webcam on if you'd like to ask the question yourself and raise your hand. Otherwise, I'll have a look at the comments in the chat box. Mike has a question. Mike, do you want to ask it yourself or shall I read it out? Maybe he's left already. Do you find a gap when applying the models, comparing what people say and what they actually do? How do you manage that when applying the models? I think you covered that a little bit, but do you want to just answer that one for us, Chris?
Yeah, sorry, Sam, could you just repeat that again?
Do you find a gap when applying the models, comparing what people say and what they actually do? How do you manage that when applying the models?
That's a good question. One thing, if we think back to the COM-B model at the start, one thing I didn't mention, but I sometimes like to do, is get these ratings of where people are on capability, opportunity, and motivation, and correlate that versus their actual behaviour. So get them to say whether they actually buy that product or prescribe that treatment or whatever. And then that can help you to sort of link the two and see which of those KPIs is actually driving behaviour the most. But I guess in some situations, it's hard to, this thing about knowing what people say and what they do. Sometimes sometimes we'll never know actually what they do, and I guess sometimes it's a case of kind of getting a bit closer to the truth, and not necessarily getting to the truth, but having the tools to get a little bit closer. So hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah. Okay. A question by Marit. Was it sunk cost bias, or the bias that the cinema staff would think you were a bad parent for leaving your child?
It wasn't really a question, but what I wanted just to highlight is there's of course always different explanations for different things. So wasn't really seriously asking you to answer that question, Chris. Thanks for such an interesting presentation.
No, thanks, Marit. No, that's definitely a fair point. And there's other things going on, as you say. It's not necessarily entirely that, but yeah, thanks for that.
Okay, well, I think there are lots of positive feedback comments, but that was the last question in the chat box. So has anybody got any questions they'd like to ask Chris? No? I think you've answered all our questions then, Chris. Well done, very clear and informative presentation. Okay, so thank you everybody for joining us today. Do come and log on for our next webinar and all the other activities that the ICG offers you. Thanks once again to Chris. It's been a really interesting session again today. Bye everyone, and see you next time.
Bye, thank you.
Thanks very much. Thank you.